Hey everybody, welcome to the Nerdy 30s review. I'm Jason, and today we're going to be diving into our review of the AMD RX 7900 XTX. Now, the model that we're reviewing is actually the XFX SPEEDSTER MERC 310 Black Edition. I think I got it all. I apologize if the sentence structure is incorrect. Absurdly long graphics card titles are a second language to me, so whatever. Now, the structure of this review is going to be basically, the first section will be me telling you my experiences with the card, the things that I've noticed, the things that really stuck out immediately. Then we'll get into overclocking, we'll do a brief foray into benchmarks and power consumption, and then we'll kind of wrap everything up at the end. So before we dive into it, I do really just want to say thank you, first and foremost. My first unboxing video, my first foray into the tech space, I just was overwhelmed with how great all of you were. I really appreciate all the input from everybody who watched, the likes, the subscriptions, just the interaction. This is really what I wanted out of my channel, was being able to communicate with people about tech, about games, and it was just so refreshing and so amazing. So I wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for all the support the channel's gotten just in that one video. So if you do enjoy content like this, drop a like on the video, make a comment, ask some questions. I'd love to have more dialogue. Subscribe to the channel because I've got a lot more tech coming as well. So with that said, we'll just go ahead and get into my first observation. Was this card is cool and quiet. Holy cow. At 60% fan curve, fully overclocked, I could never ever hear it over my CPU radiator, and it kept it very cool. Under load, it was around 55 to 60 degrees Celsius. The max I ever saw the junction temperature reach was 81 degrees, but typically it stayed around 71 to 75 degrees, and it was so smooth, so quiet, so cool, and it was such a stark contrast moving over from the EVGA 3080 Ti card. Now, I know the 3080 Ti's tend to run hot, and that particular card, I don't know if it was that just mine or if that was the model, but it was loud. It was really loud, and that was with a pretty moderate overclock, and even stock, it was something that I noticed. So yeah, it was so refreshing to just jump into a graphics card that ran 4K beautifully, and I'm talking just butter smooth frames, and it was a generational uplift in performance overall. We'll get into the benchmarks, but I was really impressed with how well it performed. Now, I mean, that's what you would expect out of a card that you pay $1,000 for. That's a current generation card. Now, the other thing I want to touch on is going to go from the pros column and lead into the cons column. So drivers. Now, my experience with drivers going into the 5000 series, 6000 series, and into the 7000 series, I will say this was a marked improvement over my experience with the previous generations. Just overall performance, overall compatibility, functionality, the software itself, the AMD Radeon software is leagues better than what I remember it to be. Now, that said, moving on over to the other side of things. In my entire suite of benchmarks, one of the ones that I really wanted to get pushed out was Plague Tale Requiem, mostly because it's a beautiful game, it really leverages next generation graphics technology, and it's a game that I love. But so, that said, I had originally downloaded it from the Xbox Game Pass, and when I decided that I really liked it, I bought it on Steam. But I was working through the game on Xbox Game Pass for PC, and it benched just fine on the RTX 3080 Ti. But when I got my 7900 XTX in there, it would crash immediately to desktop every time I launched it. Now, I reinstalled the application, I reinstalled my graphics card, I reinstalled the drivers, I moved the game into a different directory on a different drive, I manually adjusted permissions to the folder, I checked line by line through Event Viewer, and there was just nothing for it. I could not get it to work. Now, as soon as I installed it on Steam, no issue whatsoever. It ran smoothly, it ran beautifully, I never had any crashes, and it was just something worth noticing. Now, I don't know if that still is the case as of 23.2.2, but I can tell you that 23.2.1, it was still occurring. Now, the other thing that I noticed was preliminarily, when I was running all of my benchmarks on the 7900 XTX, I was using the Radeon overlay for benchmarking, so I could just kind of track my FPS. And 3 or 4 games, it just killed performance. So the splash screen, like when you'd very first log into a game, it was single digit frames per second. It was painful. And then when you got into the game, it was honestly anywhere from 10 to 30 frames per second. Once I removed that, frames shot up exponentially. So I did have to go back through and do all of my benchmarking using MSI Afterburner. It was a little bit of a hassle, but it's why I did these reviews. So the games that had really stuck out for on those were Spider-Man, the remastered version for PC that came over from PS5 or PS4, whichever, and Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. I can say that as of 23.2.2, I'm not experiencing that using the overlay for Tiny Tina Wonderlands, but I can also say that Spider-Man is still experiencing those issues. So something to look out for there. Now, the other really, really big elephant in the room is this card has the capacity to just have massive, and I mean massive, power spikes. Over the course of me benchmarking and just playing on the graphics card, most recently I was playing Returnal at 4K max settings, and it was just me playing. I'm doing a review of the game, and so I was doing a bit of recording and editing, but it was not been uncommon for this graphics card to trip my battery backup. And this is a 1200 volt battery backup that, like, it'll just start making that high pitched whining noise, and I'll have to see, I actually had to move everything that was plugged into the battery backup portion just into the surge protection portion to finish my benchmarking without going deaf. Now, last night while I was playing Returnal, it actually tripped the breaker box for my office and my son's room. Now, full disclosure, like, I had a bunch of things running. We had a heater running in my son's room because it's really cold right now. So take that for what it's worth, but it's definitely worth noting there were substantial power spikes. Overall power limit though, like power draw just on average is good. It's lower than the 3080 Ti, but the spikes are much, much higher. So something to consider. Like, I haven't had a chance to really test like the scaled back overclock or just at stock. This was my experience in overclocking the card, but there, I mean, that's what it is. So those were the things that I really noticed first out of the box. It's incredibly quiet, incredibly cool, amazing performance. Drivers are getting better, but drivers still have issues, and it does just, it can be hungry. So that's basically all I had for that, and I think we're just going to move right on over into a quick little overview of what I did for overclocking, and then we'll get into benchmarks.
All right, here we are at the AMD Adrenalin software homepage. If you're unfamiliar in how to get here, all you really have to do is drop down in your system tray, find the AMD insignia, right-click, and launch the software. Now, before I get into the nuts and bolts about how I went about overclocking my graphics card, I did want to have a quick aside for those of you who are uncomfortable in overclocking any piece of hardware, especially $1,000 graphics card that you just threw into your system. So if you want to install the graphics card, install the drivers, update them, and let the software handle everything from there on, I have no problem at all. I 100% support you in that decision. Everything that I tested, be it synthetic or games, at 4K, I received high scores. I received, minimum 60 frames per second. So there's no reason that you would need, underline, italicize, bold, need to overclock your graphics card, especially this graphics card. It runs a dream just at stock. So if you're uncomfortable with that, please feel free to go ahead and skip ahead to the performance metrics. I'll leave a link down in the description. Now, for those of you who are curious about the process in overclocking the graphics card with the Radeon Adrenalin software, it's actually pretty simple. You just go into performance, go into tuning. Now, it's currently set to default, and in order to actually get in there and start adjusting values, you'll want to go into manual tuning custom. Now, you're going to want to enable your GPU tuning, your advanced control, your fan tuning, and your power tuning. Now, I do want to have a quick note here about VRAM tuning. For my benchmarking, I did not overclock RAM. I did overclock in my testing, but honestly, I found no substantial performative gains on this, and actually in some titles, I saw performance degradation. So I'll cover how you do it, but just full disclosure, I did not overclock my RAM for these benchmarks and tests. So the first thing that I did for tuning is I maximized my power limit by 15%. Now, depending on which graphics card you've got, this will be anywhere from 10 to 15%, at least in the research that I've done. So that's all you really need to do there. Now, if this is all you're going to do, I recommend that you don't overclock at all, because all you're really going to do is cause massive power spikes, and you're not going to see that much in the way of performance gains. So the next thing I wanted to adjust was fan speed. I can't say that 100% fan speed, this does sound like a C130. Don't leave it at 100%. I found the sweet spot to be around 60%. Now, I've seen others out there who say 50 is right about where you want it. Now, I still think it's whisper quiet at 60%, and it was honestly about a 7-degree difference between the two in my experience. So GPU temperature overall was about 7 degrees cooler at 60%, and junction temperature especially was anywhere from 5 to 10. So your mileage will vary. Each graphics card is its own unique card. It's got its own unique personality. So yeah, you'll have to tinker with that on your own. But for frequencies, there are two that I'm going to go over here. So if you want to do a frame capped at, anywhere from 70 to 100 frames at 4K, you can get away with it. A minimum frequency of 2200 megahertz and a max frequency of 2700. Now, this is not going to get you all the frames in the world, but it will get you a very quiet, very cool running graphics card that is going to run forever. Now, that said, the lowest I was able to undervolt this particular configuration is 1140. Now, the lower frequency that you have, the smaller undervolt you're going to be able to do. I don't understand exactly how that is. I just know that that's been my experience. Now, what I actually benchmarked with, what I actually tested with, I went with a minimum frequency of 2500 megahertz and a max frequency of 2900 megahertz. I was able to get a full 3 gigahertz out of this in 4-game benchmarking, but once I got into synthetics and once I got into some more of the graphically demanding games like Returnal and Plague Tale Requiem, I did see some crashes. So I basically had to reset everything, go back to this. And so yeah, full disclosure, what you're looking at here is what I benched on. Oh, and the undervolt was 1130. So no issues at all with this. This was 100% stable. Now, like I said, your mileage may vary. If you see some B-SODs, or if you start to see some pretty bad artifacts, then you're going to want to start tuning your frequency first, then your undervolt. This is going to remain the same, and this likely is going to remain the same as well. So this is what you're going to be operating within. Now, for VRAM tuning, like I said, I didn't for this testing, but you'd want to go into enable and then enable your advanced control. This allows you to actually tune the frequency. Now, there is an offset of 1400 megahertz. I just recently read about that. So if you want to be operating at 2700 megahertz, which was my stable overclock, but like I said, I didn't see any substantial performance gains. I saw some degradation, but 2714 is where you'd want it. Now, I'm not going to do that, but that's the way it is. So the other thing that I noticed that I thought was really, really cool about the Adrenaline software on this is you can actually, we're going to go ahead and apply these changes. And then you can export this particular profile as just I don't think it's a CSV, but you just export the profile. You can save it to your desktop. And so we'll go OC test and save. Now, if you have like a power surge or a game crashes, and then it will reset to default. If that's the case, you'll actually get a little notification that says, hey, these profiles or settings have been restored due to an unexpected system failure. That's typically what you'll see. So you can just go back into performance. You can go to tuning and then just import a profile, OC test XML, open, proceed, and boom, we're right there again. So yeah, that was, I thought, a really cool feature, and it just kind of helped keep me at a baseline so I wasn't going back through all of these again. But yeah, So those are the settings that I had for all the benchmarking. So why don't we take a look at the benchmarks? Perfect. Jumping right into synthetic benchmarks, I do want to say that the scores that we have listed here are averages against 3 separate runs and rounded up to the next whole number. Starting off with 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra, which is essentially a DirectX 11 title 4K max settings. This is our largest lead that we see for AMD here, with the 7900 XTX coming in at 21697 versus the EVGA RTX 3080 Ti coming at 13083. This is about a 65% increase in performance overall. When we step into DirectX 12, however, the gap closes a bit, with AMD's card coming in at 14505 and the RTX 3080 Ti coming in at 10233. Now this shrinks the lead to about 41%. Now, it's going to shorten even further as we step into specific ray tracing benchmark performance, with AMD's card coming in at 16477 versus the RTX 3080 Ti's card coming in at 13493, a difference of only 22%. Now moving on over to gaming performance. I do want to preface this by reiterating that the results that we see here are from 4K maximum preset minus ray tracing. So these are largely rasterized performance metrics that we're seeing here. So starting out with Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K, we've got an average frame rate of 144.7 out of the RX 7900 XTX versus the RTX 3080 Ti's 90.8. It's a performance delta of around 71%, which is really impressive. But I do have to say that the 1% lows for the Team Red card are definitely lower than I would hope them to be. And in some cases, they were noticeable. Moving over to Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, we have an average frame rate for the 7900 XTX at 94.7 versus the RTX 3080 Ti's around 64 frames per second. This is a performance delta of around 48%, and the 1% lows are definitely much tighter for the 7900 XTX. Moving over to Plague Tale Requiem, we have the largest percentage-wise gap between the two cards, with the 7900 XTX coming in at 93.2 frames per second versus the RTX 3080 Ti's 50.2. Now, moving over to Far Cry 6, we have a little bit more competitive here as far as overall frames are concerned, with the AMD card coming in at 125.8 versus the NVIDIA card at 85.2. Now, that huge gap that you see in the 1% lows, I have to admit that I didn't notice it in gameplay, but when I saw it after benchmarking for about an hour, I was a little concerned, so I actually deleted the entry, reran, and replayed for another hour. I did this 3 times, and it kept returning single-digit 1% lows. I'm not sure what that's about. I'm not sure if that's an afterburner issue or if there are just really, really low 1% lows out of the 3080 Ti. It's just something I thought worth mentioning. This may be an anomaly. Moving over to Spider-Man Remastered, we have our closest performance yet between the 3080 Ti and the 7900 XTX, with the XTX coming in at 132.7 versus the 3080 Ti's 100.2, and that's only about a 32% difference. Now, overall, I would say that this is a legitimate generational uplift in performance overall between the 3080 Ti and the 7900 XTX. Now, I realize that we are comparing graphics cards of a different generation, but these would be comparable cards in my opinion, especially when you bring in price. And finally, we will move over to power draw. Now, we'll go ahead and get the elephant out of the room here as we see those really substantial spikes. And I was genuinely surprised to see and experience them because I know that the RTX 3080 Ti was already a power-hungry beast, especially when it came to those 20 millisecond spikes. But 541 did trip my battery backup more than once, and it did knock a breaker out at one point. So, I mean, full disclosure, I did have my laptop running, my other work laptop running, a fan running, and then, of course, it's winter here in the Great White North, so we had a heater running for my son in his room, and we share a breaker. So, it may have been an exaggeration, but it's still, those are really high spikes. Now, when we get down to standard draw, idle at 27 watts, I mean, that's what you would expect out of a next generation graphics card. And 422 and 4K gaming is, I mean, honestly, I'll take that all day. 60 watts lower than average full load draw from the RTX 3080 Ti. Now, I do want to have a caveat really quick here. I don't have much in the way of documented multi-monitor power draw, but I can confirm that it does really ramp up in certain situations. I've noticed it when I'm doing recording, which is basically I have a multi-monitor setup as my recording setup, and that's just how it works. But yeah, I didn't really have anything documented. I can confirm that the issues that are being reported for the current driver set still hold true, at least in my experience as well.
All right, so to wrap things up, the last thing we really want to talk about is price. So MSRP for the 7900 XTX reference is $999. The XFX Speedster, the X5, you can get for around $1,100. So about $100 over MSRP. And honestly, I wouldn't recommend buying anything priced higher than that. I know that there are some aftermarket cards out there that are $1,500. If you're looking at a card like that, and unless you just absolutely hate NVIDIA, then there's no reason, if you're up at that threshold, to not just spend an extra $100 and get a 4090. Now, comparatively speaking, against the 3080 Ti, the card that it replaced. So $999 MSRP versus the 3080 Ti that when it launched, its MSRP was $1,199. The 3080 Ti that I actually had in there, the EVGA for the Win 3, that one was a $1,500 graphics card too. So it's really worth noting just how out of control the graphics card market has gotten as far as price is concerned. Now, there's one thing that we can say as far as price performance goes. Current generation price performance, $999 to $1,199, like that area right there. If you don't already have a 3000 or 6000 series graphics card, absolutely, I could not recommend this card more. It's been a phenomenal experience. Some driver bugs aside, I mean, there's no company out there that's immune to driver bug issues. NVIDIA has them just a little less frequently. But the performance you get for the price of the current generation, and I know we can talk about previous generation, we can talk about prices, just inflation as a whole, but where it is right now, like, I would definitely recommend it. If you do have a 3000 or 6000 series graphics card, and we're not talking about like a 6650 or like an RTX 3060, like if you have a 3080 or a 6800 XT or a 6900 XT, 3080 Ti, if you've got one of those higher tier previous generation graphics card and you're not going to be selling it to basically recoup some of the losses for your purchase, I honestly, the improvements are substantial, but I don't know if it's really worth the upgrade to go from previous generation to this generation. Now, I am an uninhibited technoholic. I always want to have the newest, latest, greatest, so I can justify that purchase for me. And if you're of the same mind, then kindred spirits, let's do it, get one. But yeah, otherwise, I'd say you can probably hold off for the next generation, or we'll see what the refreshes have. But yeah, if you're building a new system or you just need a brand new graphics card, I cannot recommend this one enough. It's been a phenomenal experience. But I also want to say that it's been a phenomenal experience doing this benchmark and doing this video. So I want to say thank you again. I know I said it at the beginning, but I really do appreciate it. I'm really new to this, and just the reception has been so warm, so welcoming. So thank you again. If you enjoyed the content, drop a like, subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. It just keeps this incentive to keep these videos coming going, and thank you. But I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and we'll see you in the next one.